So welcome to Transform Gov. It's the Digital Government Podcast, and it's part of the Ireland eGovernment Awards, and it's brought to you by our sponsor, Accenture. So I'm Maeve Kneafsey. On today's episode, we're looking at an alternative approach for public sector bodies to explore the promise of generative AI, not by going it alone, but by working in partnership with research and innovation centres. They can provide actually a kind of a safe environment to test and to learn and to scale. And it's a very different way of emerging technologies, being tested within government departments or any sort of public sector body, and maybe mitigate some of the risks, the costs, and even the uncertainty. So we're going to find out more. And one standout example is this approach has been taken by a kind of partnership between the GenAI, well, it's also called the GenAI Lab, which is a partnership between the ADAPT Centre and Dublin City Council. So joining me to help us understand how this approach actually works and what it's delivering and the benefits is Dr. Robert Ross. He's Senior Lecturer in Computer Science at Technology University of Dublin, and he's part of the ADAPT Centre team. So Robert, you're very welcome to Transform Gov.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, Maeve.
And the voice might be slightly familiar to some of you because we've also spoken to Robert before on our Leadership Summit, which is prelude to the Ireland eGovernment Awards, which, by the way, is happening on the 18th of September. So Robert, can we start off just to explain to us how the GenAI Lab and that partnership between Dublin City Council and ADAPT came about? Like, what were you trying to do?
Yeah, well, ADAPT has had a very good working relationship with Dublin City Council for a number of years, originally working around areas in the smart cities landscape and a particular project looking at Dublin 8 and some generation work around that space. But out of those conversations and with the big boom in GenAI, over the last year or two, we had some great conversations in Dublin City Council with people like Jamie Cudden, who has always been a very big visionary when it comes to technology and how technology can...
Sorry, what does Jamie do? Just so for those who don't know.
Yeah. Sorry, Jamie Cudden is an executive leader within Dublin City Council. He looks at a number of strategic initiatives around bringing technology into the Dublin City Council space. He works with a Deputy Executive Director, Eileen Quinlivan, and a range of other people within Dublin City Council. He's very much somebody who helps to bring us into that space and advocate from their side in terms of what GenAI and other areas of technology can be used to do. So
I presume I'm going to have to jump in and ask you, do you need a Jamie Cudden in your organisation to make something like this work? And maybe we just park that for a second. Let's first talk about how this all actually happened.
Yes. So, within the ADAPT Centre, we like to work in partnership with all types of organisations, be them everything from multinationals right down through to small and medium enterprises, and working with the public sector is part of that. Public sector of different sizes and shapes, be that in the medical domain, HSE, etc. We've always been very fond of having those relationships, particularly when we can help different teams take technology into their space. So on that stream, naturally, when we knew that Dublin City Council were interested in engaging with GenAI more in a systematic way, where we'd already had some relationships with them already, that was a conversation we're very happy to have. And won't go through the business details, but obviously some sort of partnership works there, and a lot of hard effort goes on behind the scenes bringing a project like that together, both on their side and our side, from basically a business development perspective.
And when to make a relationship like that work, a partnership like that, what are the components you think you need to really be thinking about?
I think you touched on it earlier when you mentioned that within any organisation that we work with, big or small, it is important to have that visionary or team of visionaries who can really see potential. And I've seen that with different organisations over the years. I've worked, for example, in projects in the ag sector, and it really takes that one or two people like Jamie that I mentioned earlier, who can see the potential. They mightn't already know how to go about things, but they know, they suspect. And I do think you need that contact as a first position.
Yeah, I completely get that. Yeah. And I suppose you also need that they're listened to. I mean, you can have great visionaries, right? But maybe the ears that need to hear and the budget.
They need a little bit of power.
Yeah,
power, or at least to have the ear of those with power, because I think it's fair to say there are many people within organisations who have great ideas, but if they're just not at the right level at the right time, it can be hard to make things happen. That's the reality.
I suppose the other thing, it just came into my head after you said that. Is there an element of having to understand what each side is about? Because, I mean, I know when I was first starting up my own business and I worked with government agencies, I had to learn about different kind of pace of life, if you like. Now, I'm just wondering, are there other things that are different to that but similar that you have to learn about each other?
With some organisations, it's tougher than others. I think depending on the ethos of work and the priorities and the goals that an organisation have, that relationship building can be harder or easier. Honestly, I think working with the public sector bodies, I don't find the most daunting of tasks, and maybe it's because coming from the public sector as well, from our side.
Maybe you're in the same family.
We're in the same family. There's a public good interest there. There's protecting the public good, servicing the taxpayer and providing for the taxpayer. So I think that makes it a little bit connectable, where sometimes, maybe with some commercial entities, it can be more difficult because there are different priorities, and that's fine. I mean, you need a mix.
Transactional relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But in terms of... we talked before we got ready for this interview, we were talking about, a generative lab like that is kind of a safe space in a way.
Yes.
And so what makes it safe? Why does it matter, in fact, even to have a safe space when it comes to experimenting or piloting or trying out new things?
I think that idea of having a safe lab environment where we can act in partnership and where there is maybe not necessarily a commercial remit in the sense of just trying to pull money out of people's pockets, but instead looking to develop technologies in a way which is focused on the goals of the partner organisation can be very strong. That's part of a sort of a lab. That's what a lab does. The other thing is to be able to pull together expertise from many different areas, and to say this is a virtual lab where you don't need to employ all of these people permanently. You don't need to contract all of these in on staff completely, but that they're there as part of this virtual entity. And that's a model we've used a lot over the years, and not just with the public sector, by the way, but with commercial organisations as well. And the nice thing is a lab like that can grow. New projects can come in. And I think that's the key thing, that a lab really is a hub or a nexus for different projects that can spin out of that lab.
Very good. I know that just for our listeners who are dedicated people to our podcast, that we did 2 interviews with Professor Vinnie Wade, who's also part of ADAPT.
Absolutely.
And I think that probably gives some more detail about ADAPT, but you've got a centre of excellence really around lots of elements, particularly generative AI. Is that correct?
So ADAPT is a large national research centre. We have the good fortune of being funded by Research Ireland. We have 300 odd different researchers associated with us around the country, and that includes academics like myself who have a full-time job, teaching and researching, but also PhD students and what we call research fellows and so forth. And the nice thing is we have that expertise in what we'd like to call advanced digital media. So that's GenAI type content. And we like to bring it to work in different areas with people like Vinnie, who is our former director, and of course John Kelleher, who is our current director. And a lot of our actual day-to-day business can be ivory tower research, but an awful lot of it as well is engaging, coming out of the ivory tower and trying to bring that sort of technology and research that we have and apply it into industry, into organisation, into the real world. And maybe we're not all as wonderful as Vinnie at that communication side of things, but we definitely bring our different skill sets within the team. Okay, well, look, it's a perfect segue for me to say there's important people here I have to thank. So we're going to take a very quick break to thank our sponsor. Through the power of cloud, data and AI, Accenture is helping the public sector by blending human ingenuity, technology and a delivery-focused culture to turn their ambitions into action. Be ready for any challenge by adopting a continuous reinvention mindset to deliver human-centric services that adapt and grow with your needs. Contact the team at Accenture to find out more.
So we've just come back from a little break, thanking our sponsor, but we were talking about what makes a good kind of partnership in a way, and what, having kind of a generative lab or a generative AI lab partnership that's happened between ADAPT and Dublin City Council, what that can bring. But something that I didn't really realise is that you, from our conversation earlier, mentioned that it's important to have startups as part of that mix. So in other words, innovative people who are part of some sort of startup in some sort of technology contributing to the project. So why do you think that's important? What do they bring?
Startups and smaller entities and new spinning up projects can often bring an awful lot of innovation to any interactions. And it is often easy for us to stay focused only on the big players, only on the big solutions. And that's fine. I mean, they play a very important part in the ecosystem. But an ecosystem is an ecosystem when it has that diversity of players. And sometimes, honestly, some of the small players can be really agile in terms of being able to come up with novel solutions, good prototypes, push them out there and listen to the clients, and not necessarily just saying, oh, we've already got this massive enterprise system that we just want to customize a little bit to you. Instead, your startups, they're able to pivot. They're able to listen to the business needs a lot more. So I think in any engagement with a large organization, when I sit down and have conversations, it's about trying to be a little bit agnostic about technology, not coming to the table saying, this is the particular technology stack we already think you should be using because, God, we've got commercial relationships with everybody. It's about saying, no, okay, what are your problems? What are your needs? Or what generally can we help you with enhancing? And if part of that conversation is saying, oh, by the way, are you familiar with this startup over here or these guys over here who are working in this space? Then at least we have that sort of independence where we can do that, where we're not looking to get paid as part of that relationship with the others.
Yes, I get that. And I suppose the other thing is that if a startup is fairly early on, you can, in a way, the organisation can kind of form how the development happens rather than saying, look, that's the offer and that's what you get. You know, there can be kind of a quid pro quo between the two.
There is. I think it's always that balance when you're working with a smaller company or a startup in particular. It's a balance between the risk involved, obviously, with working with smaller entities. It is a little bit more risky, right? But on the other hand, being able to take advantage of that flexibility that they bring to the table, that they can shape the product, they can shape the solution to your needs. And I would argue at probably a fraction of the cost it would take for larger suppliers to do the same thing. Okay. And I think that's interesting. And it's a good way of supporting, I think, Irish innovation as well. And particularly as we move forward, we need to keep an open mind and have a big ecosystem, have the multinationals, absolutely, have the consultants as well, but also keeping in mind that there can be smaller suppliers, and GenAI, which is what we're all about, has really made it quite easy for a lot of smaller entities to bootstrap big solutions that we never could have dreamt of 10 years ago.
And look, I mean, it's changed everybody's working life in a way that you could never hope to have the capacity to do things that you can once you've got access to GenAI. And in terms of, examples, I know one example of what has an output really of that partnership was where the DCC emails that are coming in about planning applications, that you've used GenAI or you're experimenting using GenAI to kind of triage the most important applications to the top of the list, so they're not just being dealt with chronologically. Is that correct? Is that something you're working on, or where are you at?
No, not specifically yet. That is a topic that's come up in conversation. And to be fair, funnily enough, that same conversation is one that came up with, I think it was Donegal City Council at last year's event. They raised that as an interesting project that they were involved in. And it's that idea, and I think regardless of who's exactly working on what and at what phase, I think that core idea, though, of being able to take GenAI and take a process which is otherwise quite time-consuming, quite laborious due to the diversity of documentation, the amount of content, and being able to streamline that process a little bit is really important. So if we were to take that planning example, and something that is being developed by multiple partners at the moment, but take that planning example, I think you're looking at a case where wouldn't it be wonderful if you can take planning application documents and very quickly triage through them for the low-hanging fruit of where there might be issues? Now, not necessarily, definitely not taking the planning officer's responsibility out of the task, but at least being able to highlight quickly for them where there are issues so that they can verify and communicate and spend their time on the really important stuff. Better still, if you're able to allow a client at home who's putting in their planning application to submit something and very quickly then being able to automatically say to them, no, hold on. The automatic system can make mistakes, but the automatic system seems to think this is an issue. Go off, have a look at it, and then try to resubmit. Imagine the hours that can save on both sides.
Yeah, and frustration.
Yeah, and frustration, and simplify processes. And that's where GenAI is going to make a big difference. And it is making a big difference already in people and organisations' lives. Just removing that monotony and irritation of processing through documentation.
And repetition. Look, I've got to take another quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about another example that's caught my eye. And this is really more about the awards and the fact that they're now open for entries. So I'm going to take a short break and we'll be back in 2 seconds. So there is really big news happening this week.
Well, go on. What are you saying to me?
Well, it's the important time of the year. It's the Ireland eGovernment Awards. We are now ready to go. We're open for entries.
22nd year?
22nd year. I can't believe it's the 22nd year. And they get more and more exciting every year.
I think I've done all 22 years and it really is a great event.
It is. It's fantastic. I mean, firstly, it's great to recognise people who don't normally get recognised for doing amazing, amazing projects. And we've interviewed quite a lot of them on the podcast, Transform Gov, as you know. But the deadline, which is very key, is the 2nd of June.
And entry is easy?
Very, very simple. It's online. I think we ask only 5 questions about the project. I'm not saying they're easy to answer, but they're pretty straightforward for whoever's involved in the project. All online. Submit, off you go. And you can tick as many categories as you want to enter.
And closing date again?
2nd of June. So make sure you don't miss it. We're looking forward to seeing your entries. So just before we took a break there, we were talking about real life examples, possibly in theory, or things that are work in progress in terms of the generative AI lab that's going on with DCC and Adapt. But I think we talked about some procurement. Are these live pilots that are going on?
So the procurement project I'm involved in that's not specifically tied to the GenAI Lab, but I think it's a lovely example of where GenAI is coming along, because you talked about concrete examples, and the simple fact is, in a way, we use GenAI very specifically, concretely, every time we switch on our phone and there's Gemini there or there's some chat there trying to talk to us. But I think the really interesting cases are when GenAI is integrated into a typical business process. And that's the interesting stuff. And this procurement startup I'm involved in, which is called Spear, it's a spin out from TU Dublin, headed by a chap called Noel Lourdes. It's really trying to look at the optimization of procurement and procurement as a service, really, where GenAI is assisting with that service. Now, it obviously has relevance to organisations like DCC, but also commercial entities as well, in that having spoken even to lots of procurement people, nobody loves procurement, right? In the sense of truly loves it. Maybe it's because there's a heavy regulatory element to it, so it's stressful in its own way. You're making decisions with big bucks, and both sides of the table want to optimise for their position, so no one's going in to give stuff away, So for that reason, I think it's fair to say people are always looking for tools that can help with the procurement process. So in terms of procurement of a service, we see a couple of different solutions there. One is things like product or vendor search, even simply just trying to find vendors who can supply specific products and services. But where we've really zoomed in on, Noel and the team have really zoomed in on, is that whole challenge of tendering and the selection process, and looking at responses coming in from companies, filling out that bid table and saying who's offering what, are they all in compliance?
Yeah, ticking all the boxes. And again, not necessarily to make the decision, somebody else, the procurement team, make the decision, but what you want to save them from doing is copying and pasting and double checking information in the documentation that comes in versus the tender, and filling out, for example, tables of information. And that's a key example
of a real world case where the technology is now coming along to support that. So I think, coming back to your point, we're very advanced when it comes to somebody sitting down and saying, who was in the first episode of Friends, and the system giving an answer. Okay, but when it comes to integrating GenAI meaningfully into the enterprise workflow, depending on the organization, solutions are now being developed, but we're now only at the start of really deploying them and getting them in, because there are going to be questions around safety. There are going to be questions about reliability, and they're all fine. And the AI Act, even coming down the line, is going to put onus on us to know what we're using in that space.
Yes. I know we in our conversation earlier on, we were talking about some of the frustrations in both sides, preparing to put out a document for a call to tender and also responding. And that one of the things that can be just so mundane but so difficult can be, which is the right policy? Yeah. So is it up to date?
Oh my God, yeah.
And which policy is up to date and which one's the right one, actually? So are there kind of situations like that where you can see that being solved?
This is an interesting conversation that's come up, not just in the procurement task, but with a few organisations we've been working with who are really trying to do what I would consider sort of second level GenAI stuff. So first level, like I said, it's the who is in the episode of Friends. It's just asking a chatbot a task, right? The second level in the way I see the world is when you maybe have lots of documentation, rules and regulations. And again, it can be very difficult, for example, to find the HR policies that are relevant to answering a task. So an awful lot of organizations want to say, hey, okay, well, there's this GenAI stuff. Can we just slap a chatbot in front of all of our documentation and automatically answer questions on it? And it's a great idea. I've done demos, internally within our own university very quickly to show people how that can work. And the one thing that has come up with several organizations when we sit down to do that is how you can very quickly realize when you're putting together those solutions that there are inconsistencies in the documentation. There are different documents.
And
contradictions. There are different versions and contradictions. Now, unless we set up the system, it's not going to say, hey, I found these contradictions. But you can set it up to do that. You can make use of the technology to inventory through all the rules and regulations and policies that an organisation has. But that's a process. But it's an interesting one that GenAI is now opening people up to.
Wow, okay. Yeah. And just to go back again to the GenAI Lab, are you seeing things, people learning things, evolving? Because I know you at the very beginning you were saying what's really important is that the client, let's call it the client, comes in and says, look, these are the problems we're trying to solve. Yeah. And let's try and prioritise what are the most important things. But in the process, what have you learned so far that makes that work?
I think that process can be that's a process that requires trust. And actually, if we're to look at the GenAI Lab team, the lead of the GenAI Lab actually is Professor Ashish Jha. And Ashish is very into business process modification. And, from some of the conversations and some of the conversations I've had with Ashish and some of the presentations he's made, it's clear for me that there is a lack of trust in some organizations. They have a lack of trust in what their own staff are doing maybe, or what the technology can do for them. And it's about building up that trust. It might seem trivial to say that.
I wouldn't say it's easy to do.
But it's not easy. It is very important to do, because there will naturally be a hesitation. And that hesitation can come from legal side. It can come from the IT side, who are rightly paranoid about privacy and security and so forth. And anytime we talk about introducing a major change into the technological structure of an organization, understandably, people are going to clam up. So the process, the hard bit, is moving them in that direction. But I think building up the trust, having some expertise in the room in terms of governance, in terms of regulation, in terms of best practice, that can really help.
And how do you do it? I mean, expertise in the room, I can hear that. What else? Because I would think have you learnt methods for building trust?
Methods for building trust.
Okay, maybe that's the wrong word. Approaches.
Yeah, sorry, it's just when I think of methods for building trust, it seems a bit orchestrated. I think use case and best practice is always good, and to start small with proofs of concept and to bring people along the the journey, because you're never going to do a big bang approach. So it is talking about people, as we did, for example, with DCC. Again, Ashish organised this. We had a workshop in February where we took a lot of leaders from departments, brought them together, worked through, gave a presentation on what GenAI can bring to the table, what it can't, and literally workshopped problems that are in the space and talked through those problems and how GenAI may or may not be able to be useful for that. I think that's really important, because trust comes from the conversation. Trust comes from, I hate to use the term, but that safe space of a conversation, of a workshop where people can be blunt and say, is this something that can be done? And for us to be in a polite way able to say in some cases, yes, absolutely. And in some cases to say, well, you know what, that is a hard problem. And it's still a hard problem, but that's fine. You know?
At least that kind of makes people feel there's a real person at the other end, not just a noddy.
Absolutely,
right?
Not everything can suddenly be magically reinvented.
And are there developments that you're working on now that you can tell us about within the lab? Or even within ADAPT that might be interesting to our audience?
I think generally there is a big push towards transparency and, accountability within systems. I think the big push into GenAI 2 years ago with the release of ChatGPT scared a lot of people when it came to the idea of hallucinations. I think that was a good thing, by the way. I've spoken many times to people about this and said, well, you know what, if you use a GenAI system, you need to check the output to make sure you stand over it. Because
I've learned myself. I always say, if I ask a complex question and the answer is going to be very sensitive in terms of, I have to rely on that information, please provide the original sources to the information and in the answer.
Absolutely.
And then often it says, we're actually changing the answer because they don't have the sources. So there's a little bit of knowledge that you have to have in terms of how you pose the question.
And improving that quality, that's where the research is. So we talked earlier about, research versus just going out and bringing the technology to industry. The research is in issues around making sure that quality of information is there and the veracity of the information can be guaranteed. That's there on the research side. When it comes to the more applied, putting the technology in the space, there is so much we can do even within the healthcare system to improve how we deal with everything from patient records through to diagnostic information. I have a lovely project at the moment. It's an early stage project, but it's relevant for public sector, looking at translation systems and how in settings like hospitals, robotic translation powered by GenAI, where you can't get the human translator in the middle of the night in a particular language, can really improve the systems in the hospital because things aren't slowed down. Right, it's keeping things moving quickly. And that's just a nice example of where the technology stack all over the public sphere.
So give us an example of how it would work. So would a robot come and talk to you in your own language?
Literally, yeah. Well, literally what we're looking at is the scenario where you might have a patient coming in, English isn't their native tongue, and they have some problem. And we're trying not to look too much at a specific area, but everything from maternity through to the emergency is very relevant here. Now, it's medical human translators are the best. There is 100% no doubt about that. The problem is you can't always get them fast in the languages that you need. I have family who work in the medical space. This is a real problem. And so what we really are doing is developing, say, robotic systems. Not say, literally, we have robotic systems that are able to go perform translation and verbal translation. That's relatively straightforward. We can do that now.
Yeah.
The key thing, though, is in a hospital setting, things like the gestures, pointing at areas. Here's the pain. Here's where it hurts. Please apply some pressure there.
Yeah.
We're going to roll you over. Informed consent. Right?
Yes.
The nurse being able, in an informed consent way, to be able to say what procedure is about to be performed.
Yes.
Our goal is being able to automate that cheap way. A robot that's stored within the hospital, a few of them, they can be repurposed to 200 different languages. It's not like you're paying just for one language and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's the hard part for us is making sure that translation of things like the gestures which are so important for our communication, something that GenAI is good at, are very clear. But sorry, that's a bit off topic, but I think, we have to keep in mind that the public space, and particularly in Ireland, where healthcare is expensive, we have so much opportunity over the next 10 or 15 years to leapfrog from where we are, where we can barely get medical records done properly, into a space where we're top of the line in terms of applying technology. And I think we should be courageous with that.
Yes, they say you have to shoot for the stars, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And in terms of, let's say there's a CIO listening to us now, okay, and they're thinking to themselves, this really sounds great. I've got some problems I want to solve. Yeah. What would be the best piece of advice you'd give them just in terms of first steps? First steps, I think, is to talk to people. There are obviously many different companies, consultancies who are good at this work. And there are people like ourselves within the Adapt Centre. Part of our remit is from Research Ireland to go and be there to advocate for the public good, but to also just support companies. And we have bottom lines as well. We have a certain number of partnerships and projects that we need to do. So we have commercial leads like Declan McKibben is our executive director and commercial lead, who are always happy to sit down and talk to companies. They've got commercial backgrounds. We've got sales teams basically who have commercial backgrounds as well. They can strike up that conversation and get the right people in the room for the right project. Yes. But we're not the only game in town, and I'm not here just to sell that, but have those conversations. Enterprise Ireland, all the major players from a governmental perspective want to see organisations engage with technology as much as possible. And definitely there is the expertise from our side that's willing to do that. And are we talking about this only applying to big organisations, huge problems? I mean, if I'm a small semi-state body, or I'm a, small local authority, do you think, I don't think it's going to fit for you? I think absolutely companies right down to what I would classify as small SMEs and organisations that are of that size can have and should have those conversations. An awful lot of firms, an awful lot of semi-state bodies and small organisations, they don't have the expertise necessarily to hand to engage with technology as quickly as they'd like to. But they want to. And coming back to our point earlier, that CTO or that CIO may be that person in the organisation who really sees that potential and wants to see technology grow. And they're looking at their staff headcount and on the other hand saying, just everyone's flat out already. So go and have the conversation, see if there are opportunities to partner up. We do partially funded projects, for example. Research Ireland pay part of the funding of the project. And for us, what we like, because you might sit there and say, well, what's in it for us? Because we're certainly not charging commercial rates. We like the real world experience because it makes sure that our research becomes more relevant to the real world. And that's really important to us. Well, that's such a good point, because I think, firstly, if somebody goes in and works with you in whatever scenario, it may not be that you roll out the whole solution in the end of the day. It's a place to experiment with what might work, to pilot it, to try different technologies that having no, I suppose, loyalty to particular technology. And then when that's been successfully deployed, then it becomes perhaps something that goes out for tender, right, at a much bigger scale. You've touched on a very important point there. We really like to specialise in that initial stage of investigation and proof of concepts, and actually building proof of concepts that work. But when it comes to enterprise level support or even just long-term real commercial support, that's not what we do. It's not what we're good at, and we don't want to do it. But we will happily, hopefully, have moved the organisation to a point where they can have that relationship then with a commercial provider, keep things going into the future, and really know that what they're adapting is honestly the best solution that's for their problems. And I think we were talking to the NLI who also won an award at last year's awards, and their approach was very interesting. They knew exactly what they wanted to do before they went out to tender. Now that's okay in a way if you're in something that's been done before. Yes. But when you're going into GenAI, who's done it before? We don't know. There's not that many case studies, and certainly not the kind of institutional experience of doing it. So stepping into some sort of lab environment is a great place to start. Yes. To understand what is possible, and experiment and not be pushed down a certain track too quickly.
Do you know, one of the things that I find most interesting is how many organisations believe that they need to 100% pay for the external power of external data centres to run state-of-the-art GenAI. So the large language models, the technology that underpins ChatGPT and so forth. Absolutely, it can make sense to use those commercial cloud-provided solutions, but it always puts a smile on my face when I explain to people and they realise that actually you can just pay for a decent machine to sit over there in the corner and it can run a state-of-the-art GenAI large language model solution that's really capable and really good, and it can be plugged in over there, and you can make sure that your data for your proof of concept can stay in the room, never going to leave the room, and if you're unhappy with it, pull out the plug. And it's all fine. And people just don't realise that. Now, that doesn't scale to running thousands of cases. And that's where you go back then to the cloud, to the big providers. But when it comes to just being reassured about that safety of an initial GenAI deployment, I do think that that's something that I like to make sure that people are aware of.
Okay, well, look, I learn something new every time we do a Transform Gov podcast, and today definitely one. So that's really interesting. But look, I think there's great future in what you're doing, and I particularly around DCC, because they're probably replicating many of the challenges that other local authorities and other agencies have got. So when you have more pilots coming out, I know it's very early stages, you'll have to come back and tell us about them.
Absolutely, we will.
Okay, and thank you so much. But if you were casting a magic wand, what would you like to see happen across government to kind of help in that kind of innovation to thrive more?
Okay, so I'm not going to state the obvious around integrated healthcare solutions. I think that's one we're all a bit.
We might be just a bit jaded.
Bit jaded on.
Yeah.
I really think in terms of answering client, I mean citizen queries quickly with respect to everything from social welfare claims right through to general information inquiries. That's stuff that's relatively easy to do well, and we can speed up systems to make sure that the civil service staff that are hard put upon already can focus on the harder tasks. Yeah. And if we can make use of technology in a way that the citizen, the client, is still happy with, right, is still comfortable with, and they understand that, no, they can speak to a person if they want to speak to a person. They can get their information reviewed by people if they want it reviewed by people. But on the other hand, are happy to, say, allow their form to be triaged by online systems. If we can get that ethos across all departments equally, it can really lead to a speed up, I think, in the services. Well,
look, it's very exciting, and I agree with you, because we're all using, to a lesser or greater degree, ChatGPT and other solutions like that probably are not anywhere near as accurate as the ones that are going to be built specifically for organisations to answer questions, which less chance of actually getting the wrong answer, okay?
That's right.
So there's a lot of potential in that. So Robert, so interesting, and thank you so much for joining us on Transform Gov.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
So I want to thank our listeners, because we may not know this, but we're getting a bigger and bigger following all the time for Transform Gov. So it's become a bit of a hit. So it's down to people like Robert joining me and telling me their stories. But if anybody else is out there and they think, look, we've done something really innovative and we really want to share the story, you can contact us by going to digitalgovawards.com. And before I leave you all, I have to first thank the studio team. So studio manager Peter Rice, video editor Neil Horner, sound engineer Lee Brennan, videographer Louis Griffin, and finally, thank you to Dublin Podcast Studios. Goodbye.